Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
Welcome to this exclusive interview with Stewart Patrick, the Senior Fellow and Director of the Global Order Institution Program at the prestigious Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Joining alongside him, we have Minh-Thu Pham, a non-resident scholar in the Global Order Institution Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's also the Executive Director for Global Policy at the United Nations Foundation, where she led initiative to tackle the global challenges, including helping to create and deliver the Sustainable Development Goals and financing for development. Together, they've co-authored a compelling article titled 5 Things to Watch at the UN General Assembly opening, providing a nuanced perspective on the unfolding events and the critical factors that demand our attention in the realm of international diplomacy. In the following discussion, we will delve into the analysis, offering a glimpse into the surrounding the annual opening of the 70th session of the United Nations General Assembly, which convenes on 19 September 2023. So thank you so much, Patrick and Minh-Thu, for taking your time and speaking to us.
Great to be here.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you. Minh-Thu, do you want to give a survey of what we normally expect?
Well, normally we would expect a bit of a circus around the UN. I'm here in New York, and maybe first and foremost, for most people who aren't as familiar with the UN, the first thing they know is that world leaders descend in New York for the week. And that's heads of state and government from all over the world. The UN is the only universal multilateral organization that we have. And so you have member state, heads of state and government from all over, including those who may not have the best of relations with the host government, the United States, as well as obviously a slew of others. And the second thing that most people, at least New Yorkers, are concerned about is the traffic. So here in New York last night, there was quite a bit of gridlock, and I think we'll expect that. But that said, so Tuesday, as you mentioned, Ratnadeep, is the first day of the high-level event when the heads of state and government come to speak. So you'll have the President of the General Assembly, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, speaking, as well as then a host of governments. And President Biden will be there speaking among the first speakers and on down the line. The other big thing is that today and tomorrow is the marking of the halfway point for the Sustainable Development Goals. So as some of you may know, the SDGs were agreed in 2015. It's a set of 17 time-bound, ambitious goals for ending extreme poverty, curbing climate change, and tackling inequality, and by 2030. So it's about 169 targets, a lot in that agenda, but it is pretty amazing that 193 countries around the world agreed to them in 2015. And so this is the halfway mark. So we are assessing progress. I can talk a little bit more about that later, but that's today and tomorrow. And then you've got a few high-level meetings on global health issues, the pandemic preparedness, universal health coverage, tuberculosis. There's also a meeting on financing for development, a ministerial on the Summit of the Future, and some other meetings, a big UN Security Council meeting on Ukraine, and on down the line. So it's a busy week. What makes it even busier is that it's the first full-fledged UN General Assembly in person since before COVID. And I think that accounts for the traffic outside my window right now.
Yeah, and that actually is a great primer of what the General Assembly session or how does the General Assembly look like. So I wanted to start with your article that you wrote. So what recent global events have catalyzed discussions about restructuring the United Nations Security Council, and how have influential leaders like the US President Joe Biden contributed to this dialogue in 2022?
Yeah, thanks. I'll go ahead and take the first crack at that one. Obviously, among all the issues that the UN faces in terms of its structure and organization, one of the most fraught ones, and perhaps the tightest of all Gordian knots, is the issue of the structure of the Security Council, which, of course, as you know, is the premier body, multilateral body for issues of international peace and security, including the ability, the monopoly, in a sense, on authorizing the use of armed force in matters other than self-defense. The composition of the UN Security Council has not changed since 1965, when four new elected members were added to the council, making for a council of 15 with 5 permanent members that wield the veto and, of course, are the victor powers in the Second World War. So there's a lot of background conditions that have caused a desire among many countries to actually change the composition of the council, and one of them is simply this shifting distribution of global power. As you know, India is a major aspirant to a Security Council seat, among others, and obviously now the most populous nation in the world. And so India, but also a number of other countries have been agitating for a long time to be brought into the high table, if you will, of international politics. But in terms of your immediate question, the recent global event that's really catalyzed things is, in particular, the war in Ukraine. It's seen as an example of something we've seen too often, which is a great power abusing its privilege within the UN Security Council and taking advantage of its veto power to in a sense engage in a war of aggression in this case. And so there's a growing dissatisfaction with the council as the council members as not being custodians of global order, but in fact often violators of global order. More broadly, there's a sense that not only is it not as effective as it might be, and increasingly some of those geopolitical conflicts are spilling over into other areas, but it's also not globally representative. I think those two things, the fact that it doesn't include major emerging powers, and also that it simply is less effective at doing the business that it has the mandate to do, and that it's less globally representative. All of those things are militating or increasing pressure for change. Now, President Biden surprised much of the world last year when he took to the podium at the UN General Assembly by calling for the first time, or by saying that for the first time, that the United States was in favor of increasing permanent membership, not only for the usual suspects in a sense that it's long supported, like Germany, Japan, and more recently India, but actually for Latin America and Africa. And that is a big deal because it has unblocked some of the formerly frozen diplomacy. And it's made it clear that the United States, at least rhetorically, is not an obstacle to enlargement. And it's put a number of other countries on the spot, not least Russia and China, but also the African Union, which now faces the challenge of actually being explicit about which particular countries it would like to have two permanent members join. So there's a lot more ferment. That the hurdles remain incredibly high to Security Council enlargement, but that's where we stand right now.
Also, this brings me to the next question regarding the Security Council reform. What are the critical obstacles hindering substantial progress, and how can these impediments be effectively addressed to realize meaningful reforms?
The reform of the Security Council would take a charter amendment, which is, and one of the only a handful of previous charter amendments was that in the 1963 decision that then led to the enlargement in 1965. The procedural and geopolitical hurdles are immense. Let me just talk about the procedural hurdles first. To get an amendment to the UN Security Council requires there to be a 2/3 vote of support of 2/3 of the members in the UN General Assembly, including all of the permanent 5 members. And of course, they have a veto and could prevent this. But it also requires passage of relevant domestic legislation by all of the countries, or at least 2/3 of the members of the UN General Assembly. And one could imagine, particularly in the case of the United States, were to support this at an executive level, that getting that sort of an agreement through the U.S. Senate would be extremely difficult in most circumstances, given the polarization on Capitol Hill. Beyond that, there are huge political and geopolitical obstacles. The most important really is the fact that right now you have sort of a horn-locked situation within the UN General Assembly, where you have three major blocks. There are the aspirants to permanent membership of the UN Security Council, some of the ones that I mentioned: India, Germany, Japan, also Brazil, but their allies. There is also a coalition of countries called the Uniting for Consensus Coalition that basically is spearheaded by the regional rivals of those same countries. So they are, one can imagine Pakistan, for instance, or perhaps Argentina in Latin America being less than enthusiastic about their neighboring countries being permanent members of the UN Security Council. And then there's a United African Bloc, which has insists on a veto, 2 permanent members, 3 new elected members, and yet it has not chosen who the members would be. So there are a number of decisions and compromises that would need to be made. Some countries, I should add, do not want to have any permanent members, but only an expansion in elected members. And then finally, you have divisions amongst the major Security Council permanent members. So all in all, as you can imagine, a very, very difficult diplomatic landscape to get any reform through. Last thing I'll say is, though, that the continued failure to have the Security Council look like the world as it exists today does create the potential for a legitimacy crisis as countries either begin to ignore or discount what the Security Council looks like and what it decides.
Well, now moving on from the Security Council discussion to the SDGs, I wanted to ask about, since it's going to approach the halfway mark, and we have seen a slight regression during the pandemic. Now, considering the current world events, how can the international community regain traction in achieving the SDGs and overcome the setbacks like the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, it's essentially the question of the week. When world leaders agreed to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, in 2015, we all knew that it was very ambitious. The goals, some of them, when you look at them, they are, first of all, they're universal. So every country in the world is supposed to achieve them. And they cover a vast range of issues, everything from ending extreme poverty to peaceful and inclusive societies to livelihoods for people. So it is a pretty vast agenda. And we all knew that it was going to take everyone from all sectors of society to step up and really focus on this. And then, of course, you have the pandemic hit, as you mentioned, and that set us back. So we have reversed progress because of the pandemic, but I think some would say that we were already having a difficult time getting there anyway. There are, right now we're on this trajectory, we're 300 years away from gender equality. There are 4 times more, there's a lot more people in extreme poverty than there were, 4 years ago before the pandemic. And we're behind progress or reverse progress on a third of the Sustainable Development Goals, and only achieving them or on the right track for 15% of them. So those are pretty sobering numbers. And in terms of what it's going to take, I think, that's essentially what world leaders are gathered here in New York to try to discuss. How do we inject more political commitment into this? How do we sort of demonstrate that there is global solidarity between countries, and that some of the competition and the nationalism and the maybe stinginess that countries have shown over the last few years can be overcome? Because we know that there are these major disruptions are going to make it a whole lot harder for people to feel secure in their own countries, and those have ramifications geopolitically and otherwise. The Secretary General has proposed an SDG stimulus, essentially proposed that world governments support 500 or contribute $500 billion a year to help us achieve the SDGs. Whether or not there's any support for that is a question. There is support in the draft declaration that is supposed to be agreed this week, but there are a lot of tensions. Even just this morning, I saw a letter from 11 countries who are subject to sanctions saying that they don't want to agree to move forward on these really critical issues until their own special interest needs are addressed. Universal, coercive measures, unilateral coercive measures is a block. That said, it was pretty remarkable to see countries like the United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Japan, and others in the end accept pretty bold language on international financial institutions reform. We know that if we don't get the funding and political commitment in the right place, we're going to have a pretty hard time to achieve them. So those are things, as Stewart and I wrote in our piece, things that we are going to be looking for. And I know that a lot of governments are here to focus on the SDGs. There's going to be a lot of other issues discussed, but that is the main game, and that's what we're all going to be looking out for.
So, ma'am, in the pursuit of SDGs, what strategies can nations employ to accelerate the progress and overcome the impediments, particularly in the wake of unforeseen global events?
In 2015, part of the strategy for achieving the SDGs was to include as many sectors of society as possible. So usually these UN negotiations happen behind closed doors. A few, leaders, a few governments essentially decide on the agenda for the rest of the world. And in the years leading up to 2015, governments, especially developing countries, said that's not going to be good enough. We need to make sure that this is an open decision-making process that allows everyone to be part of it, or at least voices of others, experts, civil society organizations, private sector companies that really know how to deliver, to contribute their ideas. And what you ended up having was that because they were part of the process and included, not in the decision making, but at least in terms of shaping what the SDGs should look like, they really felt a lot more ownership over the goals. And so one of the strategies is, how do you make sure that we are harnessing all of the knowledge and expertise and the great work that so many sectors of society are doing? I can't turn left without seeing a private sector company deciding that the SDGs is going to be one of the frames for how they carry out their business, or investors deciding to put their money where their values are, or civil society organizations deciding to stand up and say, this is where we're going to reshape our missions to really focus on the SDGs. So you really do need a kind of whole of society approach. We've got to figure out how to harness that and push that in the right direction. And I'm hoping to see some signals this week on that.
If I could pick up on that, those great comments from Minh-Thu. In terms of unforeseen global events, there's no question that that the pandemic in particular, and then of course the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the economic fallout from that happened, including food security, energy security, price spikes in both of those sectors, has really been amongst the most damaging things that has happened to the developing world, developing countries. And I think that the SDGs in some ways were about making the world more equitable and making it more inclusive. But I think what we've seen is that it also needs to be made more resilient, and creating situations and backstop mechanisms that might be able to address that. There's something called the Bridgetown Agenda, which has been proposed by the government of Barbados under the Prime Minister Mia Mottley. And that would help transform some of the international financial institutions. We can talk more about that agenda, but one aspect of it is would include increased financing for climate shocks, for instance, which, as we know, are becoming more and more apparent. And I think that that needs to be something that comes out of this SDG summit, is really a sense that there needs to be greater cushions And that again is in at least part of the Secretary General's SDG stimulus plan, or alongside of it would include some greater resources for contingencies that occur that we just haven't been anticipating. It's also part of his the agenda that he has for the summit for the future, is really creating not just new financing mechanisms, but new sort of strategic over the horizon threat scanning initiatives, mechanisms, so that the world can be better prepared and for all sorts of problems that we may. Even if we can't anticipate the exact emergency, we can have a sense of structure. We can have structures in place to have a rapid reaction, a response to that.
And actually, that brings me to the next question that I wanted to ask. I can actually keep it open, so you can also join. But I would ask actually, Minh-Thu, the first part of it, because since you've worked actually in building up the SDGs at the United Nations Foundation, and looking at the financing part for development, how can partnership between public, private, and civil society sectors be leveraged to bridge the gaps in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, ensuring a holistic, inclusive approach to development?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's been a big part of the discussion around achieving the SDGs, almost since before the SDGs were agreed. How do you leverage private finance, especially with, I think a lot of donor countries are feeling the weight of pressure to either meet the 0.7 GDP targets, and they have their own domestic issues to deal with in terms of political support for that kind of thing. And there have been discussions around how do you use the precious resource of official development assistance to then leverage that for private finance. And I think what we've seen over the last few years is that is actually quite difficult. In fact, I just saw a World Bank study that looked at this, and after a few years, they found that it's incredibly inefficient. So I think one of the challenges is just the question you asked: is how do we really leverage this so there is a holistic and inclusive approach? Some of the things that Stewart just mentioned in terms of reform and new ideas, or at least new political momentum for ideas around the international financial institutions, is part of the answer. But here it's been difficult, and we do know that everybody should be part of this problem solving, but we'll see how that goes. The other thing is that I think a lot of folks have started to do analysis on the interconnectedness between the goals. So if you were to target your approaches and find interventions where it's not just about one particular set of targets or goals within the SDGs, but that can really open up for others, what are those things that can really help to achieve more than one goal, say, at a time? And there have been some interesting analyses on that, including some that were just launched earlier this week, which I'm happy to send you some information on. But this is a big question.
I was going to say that one of the things that in your question was a bit on the private sector, and I think that one of the disappointments over the last several years is the relative failure to leverage the private sector as much as possible. Since the SDGs were basically approved, there's been a lot of talk about moving in terms of financing from billions to trillions to deal with things like huge infrastructure projects, or to in a sense use the risk guarantees of governments and international financial institutions to basically leverage and mobilize private sector activity and use the profit motive, in a sense, to help advance global development in a sustainable way. And it's simply been less effective than it might have been. So I think going forward, sort of a redoubling of experimentation in terms of how one can can mobilize private sector financing, as well as, frankly, sometimes what they call domestic resource mobilization. In foreign assistance and financial contributions from other parts of the world should not be a substitute, but hopefully a complement to, tax revenues and the spending that allows in terms of fiscal capacity of a lot of developing countries. And so it's important for development assistance, official development assistance, to crowd in as opposed to crowd out domestic efforts. And that is not always done. Sometimes as a reflection of poor governance in some of the countries we're talking about.
In the light of that, what innovative approaches and mechanisms can be employed to mobilize essential fundings for global development initiatives and projects?
Sure. Let me take a first stab at that. One of the things that that agenda is very much on the mind of the leaders of international financial institutions. Secretary General Guterres, as well as the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, have both spoken of the need for, quote unquote, a new Bretton Woods system. And that would entail a number of things that, in a sense, go beyond the immediate scope of what the Secretary General has purview over for his, in terms of the United Nations itself. One of the things that the World Bank is working on right now is something called the Evolution Roadmap for World Bank reform, and among other things, it would help transform first of all, augment the resources that are available to the World Bank, particularly concessional the financing, but it would also increase the amount of funds that the World Bank has at its disposal that are devoted to so-called global public goods. And that would include things like that where the bank has already put its foot in the water a bit, but the financing, for instance, for sort of climate mitigation and adaptation, financing for pandemics, financing for humanitarian crises, increased financing for fragile and conflict-affected states. So there are a number of different mechanisms that are being considered. Another one by the IMF is the potential expansion of what are called special drawing rights within the International Monetary Fund. There has been expansion of those, and this is an idea of creating greater liquidity in the global system. But the problem is that when you expand those SDRs, as they're called, they are expanded in proportion to what the shareholders have put into the International Monetary Fund, or their in a sense their quota share. So most of that money has gone to, of course, the world's wealthy countries, and there was an expectation that they would use those SDRs to recycle them for development purposes. That, in fact, has not occurred at nearly the scale that one would want to see. And so there's a little bit of a hitch there in terms of, advanced market democracies in particular saying, of course, we care about development, but then when they get the resources, they're not necessarily putting them back into development purposes.
Now, moving on from that, actually, how can nations and international organizations demonstrate a united front in addressing global health concerns and ensuring equitable access to healthcare resources and vaccines for all? Since Patrick mentioned about the SDR, the last general allocation was, I think, in 2021. And we have seen the Board of Governors approved an allocation of $465 billion, actually. So how can this international organization actually demonstrate such united front combating global health concerns?
I'm happy to take the first crack at that, Minh-Thu, unless you'd like to.
Go ahead.
Thanks. One of the biggest disappointments of the COVID response, and frankly, one of the biggest sources of grievance on the part of developing countries and emerging economies was the global response to the pandemic. Unlike in some previous crises, there really was a decision by some of the world's leading countries to not only try to quarantine themselves from the rest of the world, but to engage in nationalistic behaviors, including most appallingly vaccine nationalism, which is, a sense of in which countries will hoard not just the vaccines themselves, but the technology behind them, et cetera, and resist having other countries gain access to them because they're protecting those limited resources for their own populations. And so we saw that, and a lot of sort of, protectionism for, personal protective equipment, et cetera, throughout the world. And so there was a total lack of solidarity right when it was needed most. And I think that in the aftermath of the pandemic, there's been a sense that, this needs to stop. And there are many different initiatives out there, including COVAX, and a number of different initiatives to try to make sure that there's some global distribution and sort of preventive deployment of capacities for indigenous production of vaccines and therapeutics in these situations. But I know Minh-Thu knows quite a bit about this, and can talk about some of the health. Some of the health aspects of the health summits that are coming up alongside the UN General Assembly. But there are a number of different initiatives that need to occur also outside of the confines of the immediate confines of the UN General Assembly. The World Health Organization, for instance, has a number of trade rules, but also some waivers. There's TRIPS waiver for the production of vaccines. There's also opportunities for countries to basically declare and give their own domestic manufacturers license to, in a sense, manufacture things that might be under intellectual property. So you have a little bit of a collision between global trade rules on the one hand and the sort of what's needed during pandemic emergencies. I should also mention that the World Health Organization and other groups have taken opportunities to try to begin to address some of these issues, and some of these issues will be taken up at the World Health Assembly, in which convenes in September 2024.
Yeah, and just to follow up with that.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, May 2024, I should say. Sorry.
Yeah, and maybe just one quick point on that is, just to your question about demonstrating a united front, that is really the key to this. Stewart just laid out some of the responses that we saw to COVID and the lack of solidarity between countries. And so how now, in the aftermath of that, and especially where we've seen, SDGs progress and other things backtracking, it really is a moment to demonstrate a united front. And on these global health summits, negotiations that are taking place to find better ways to respond to the next global pandemic, issuing an update of the rules for how, for the obligations and duties that countries have to report and manage cross-border, public health emergencies like a pandemic. Those rules are being updated, and those negotiations, as Stewart said, are going to culminate in May of next year, and it's quite fraught right now. Typically, these negotiations are around technical issues, but this time around, as you mentioned here, ensuring equitable access. Equity is a part of is why these negotiations are quite tough, because a lot of developing countries and others are saying access and equity has to be a key part of this, because we saw what just happened. And if it's just about technical concerns, it's just not going to be enough to meet the moment. So we're watching for it.
Right, man. Thank you. So, as the world undergoes shifts in power dynamics, how can the UN assert its relevance and centrality in managing international affairs amidst a multipolar geopolitical landscape?
Thank you very much. I think you've put your finger on a major problem, Ikam, which is that at every UN General Assembly, there's a quest to demonstrate the UN's relevance, but I think that has gotten more challenging recently, and in part because countries are experimenting with a variety of geopolitical configurations and a variety of multilateral and minilateral frameworks that give the United Nations some significant competition. We are in a fragmenting world. The UN has always been vulnerable to geopolitical confrontation. Witness the Cold War years, of course, where for 4 decades, the UN was actually, frankly speaking, somewhat irrelevant to much of what was going on in the world in terms of great power competition. There was some euphoria at the end of the Cold War, and obviously there have been ups and downs over the last 3 decades. But the UN had moved back into a more central place. But I think more recently there is this sense that the logjam amongst the great powers makes it increasingly difficult for the UN to be seen as the only game in town. And you've seen a proliferation of these different alternative frameworks. Obviously, the West has been doubling down on the G7 and the NATO alliance in the wake of the war in Ukraine. You've seen the emergence of the BRICS as a major forum, although obviously driven by internal divisions itself, not least between China and India. And then you've seen the rise, in a sense, of the global South, the rise in the sort of identity and of a group of countries that believe that international order is stacked against them. So the United Nations definitely has a difficulty asserting its relevance. To some degree, this will boil down to the decisions of the great powers and emerging powers make to not, in a sense, to use the cliche, throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that they need to develop policies and strategies to try to compartmentalize their geopolitical rivalry to focus on more functional cooperation in important areas of shared interest, like pandemics, which we were just talking about, like climate change. The difficulties recently has been that some of those geopolitical disputes have shifted over, have sort of spilled over to areas of practical cooperation, and I think that's one of the most disappointing things. But from the Secretary General's perspective, he can use the bully pulpit, he can serve as a spokesperson for this, but we have to remember that the United Nations itself is a collection of member states, and so is quite reliant on what they decide. Minh-Thu, I'm sure, may have some comments on this.
Well, just to your point about these dynamics spilling over into the UN, it almost feels like it's part of the bargaining process, where some of the positions that countries like this that are involved in the expanded BRICS are now bringing their positions into UN negotiations, and it's increased their leverage in the negotiations because the UN can see that there are these other alternative clubs and affinity groups. So I think that's part of the process of negotiations, and because the UN is the only universal body, you see that playing out. It's the only body where the emerging powers and the sort of major traditional powers, as well as smaller developing countries, are represented. And so in a way that is itself, the UN's relevance. Now, whether decisions at the UN are the ones that end up being, shaping world order is another question, but it does spill over and then come back to what ends up happening at the UN.
Yes, and how can international cooperation play a part in this by strengthening to mobilize development financing, effectively ensuring that adequate resources are allocated to pressing global development needs?
Much of the challenge lies in how one defines global development needs. And I think that here, one of the major dilemmas that the global donors face is basically deciding how they're going to divide their relatively scarce resources. And we are in a time of some retrenchment in terms of official development assistance. How are they going to divide those resources between those that are allocated to bilateral financing, traditional sort of country to country efforts that are defined by, in a sense, the developing country governments and societies, versus the amount of the amount of that's spent on global public goods. And so I think that's a dilemma they face. The other issue I think that's important to mention is that there are a number of non-traditional donors, not least China, but also India, Turkey, et cetera, who have become major donors, global donors themselves. And yet it's important to make sure that there's coherence amongst their activities so that they don't work at cross purposes with one another or duplicate each other's things.
To strengthen the global security and global health security, how can nations collaborate to enhance healthcare infrastructure, knowledge sharing, and research, showcasing solidarity and a joint commitment to a healthier world?
Well, there are a number of innovations and efforts underway. There have been, since in the wake of the pandemic, there have been huge numbers of reports released, including a major independent evaluation of the UN and broader international community's response to pandemic preparedness and response. So I think that strengthening global healthcare infrastructure is something that has been on the mind of many people. There have been initiatives that have been taken on sort of early warning and pandemic, in terms of pandemic prevention and early warning systems around the world. There are efforts to expand scientific exchange, which obviously need to be ongoing. One of the major priorities is strengthening the authorities and capacities of the World Health Organization. The WHO may sound like it's a large body, but it actually has the funding of a large, perhaps a single large hospital system in the United States. So that funding needs to be increased. There need to be fewer earmarks and restrictions on the way it spends its money. It needs to have more authority over its offices in the field. And importantly, there needs to be a strengthening of something called the International Health Regulations, which are the only legally binding set of obligations of countries in cases of global pandemics. Those reforms need to be undertaken, but there's a lot of resistance from countries who are quite sovereignty-minded, not least China, in this regard.
I actually wanted to ask a little bit about, we have already spoken about how multilateralism is actually, in this context, the UN context, we have seen how valid it is at this point of time. Just wanted to ask about, with the constant evolution of power dynamics, and we have seen a lot of minilaterals, plurilaterals, and even regional groups coming into the picture. How much UN still afloats to solve today's crisis amidst those plurilaterals and minilaterals and regional groupings coming in?
I mean, I'll go first here. I'm into just, I would say that, I think the United Nations needs to get better at partnering, and not look at these additional instruments and frameworks, and in particular regional and sub-regional organizations as potential allies. And so it's not a case necessarily of burden shifting, but perhaps more of burden sharing. And the United Nations, as Minh-Thu knows, has spent a lot of time thinking about, for instance, what its relationship with the African Union might be. And we're talking here about mediating international disputes and fostering international cooperation. And I think in the same way that it's becoming more flexible and trying to become more flexible in dealing with non-governmental organizations, Minh-Thu has written about networked multilateralism. And I think that an important part of networked multilateralism is that it involves not just the United Nations and a universal membership organization, but those that are on the ground and have, or in the region, and have a sense of what needs to be done and what the lightning rod issues are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the UN partnering with regional organizations is a big part of the answer here. The other is the good offices function of the UN, and that's essentially the diplomatic work that the mediators, the UN staff, envoys, and especially the Secretary General undertake to mediate between parties in a conflict. That's been historically an important role for the UN officials, for UN officials, and in particular for the Secretary General. But it largely depends on the credibility that these UN officials have. When parties of a conflict see that they are credible and believe that they will be honest brokers, then they can be much more effective. And I think in just the conversation we've had, we've laid out some of the tensions and the challenges that the UN is undergoing, and that reflects in how effective it can be in mediating between parties in a conflict. You see the role that the Secretary General is playing, or maybe hopes to play, on Ukraine, and especially the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And while it was a success for a short period of time, where we'll see what ends up happening, but it is an indication as to where governments see UN officials being able to play the role that they can play in mediating and helping to resolve some of these conflicts.
Thank you, ma'am. Considering the urgency of addressing climate change, how can nations come together to pool resources and investments to transition to sustainable energy sources and mitigate environmental degradation?
This has been one of the biggest disappointments. Obviously, for probably almost as long as the SDGs has been around, the wealthy nations, actually even longer than that, I think probably around 2009 or 2010, UN member states agreed to start, donor countries in particular, to mobilize up to $100 billion a year in climate financing, particularly for mitigation and adaptation purposes, and have consistently fallen short. They're getting closer to it, but they've already missed the target 3 or 4 years running. So obviously, the world needs to take bigger steps to generate and mobilize that climate financing. There are also, as you know, at the last conference of parties, the last big climate conference that was in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, there was the creation of a loss and damage fund, or at least the proposed creation for a loss and damage fund that would help compensate developing countries, frankly, for the injuries that have been caused to them from climate change, when the responsibility for that in terms of emissions is almost overwhelmingly from other countries, advanced market countries. So there are major issues there. The other issue that I should point to is that although there are a number of different exciting partnerships around the world and incredible advances on renewable resources and renewable energy resources, India's move in solar, some incredible movement for electric vehicles in China, for instance. The world obviously continues to rely on fossil fuels heavily, not least in China and India, but also in the United States. And one of the most disappointing trends, particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sort of emphasis on energy security that came out of that, is really a doubling, tripling, quadrupling of spending on fossil fuel subsidies amongst the G20 countries, which said that they were going to eliminate those. And so that's a huge stumbling block to this green energy transition that you're mentioning.
Yeah. And one thing just to add to that is that the Secretary General is holding a climate ambition summit this week to really try to galvanize countries coming together to address this. We also have the Conference of the Parties. This is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change meeting in November in Dubai. And this is essentially his attempt at trying to galvanize more attention around climate change. But as Stewart said, it is a real, challenge, and not a lot of great progress. In fact, reversing progress on the use of fossil fuels. So again, an opportunity for governments to demonstrate solidarity, but we seem to be not going in the right direction.
Perfect. And I just have one last question to ask. if you could do like a fastest finger first and ask what are the top 5 agendas that you find being tabled at the General Assembly.
So obviously this issue around the Sustainable Development Goals is just huge. And I really hope that just because we have this moment to mark the halfway point and we have a lot of commitments and a lot of, excitement and, energy around it this month for the UN General Assembly, that we don't forget that. Nicholas Kristof wrote, I think it was last night in the New York Times, about the seeming hypocrisy of having a lot of world leaders coming together and whining and dining themselves and then leaving at the end of it, patting themselves on the back. And yet then what happens to the fate of people in developing countries, people who just, need to see a different impact, in their lives. And then they see what's happening in New York and wonder how is that going to affect them. And so, that's one, the SDGs and how we address those things. Another is the health issues. So will we be able to show solidarity in equity and access for the things that really matter to people? We saw it come to a head with the pandemic. How do we address that? Financing, we've addressed that quite a bit on this call, but it's the UN can send political signals, but really a lot of the decision making on financing issues happens elsewhere. But the UN is the only universal forum. And so if developing countries are going to say, we need more financing, we need more concrete commitments and measures to make sure that happens, that's another. Fourth, I would say is some of the peace and security issues. The Secretary General has laid out a new agenda for peace and trying to help renew the UN's work on a range of conflict mediation, norms around nuclear weapons, a lot of that, it's a huge bucket, but just to say, if you're only going to give me 5, I'll put that all in one. And then lastly, reform of of global governance. He has proposed, and member states will hold next year in 2024 at the UN General Assembly, a year from now, a summit of the future to essentially renew multilateralism. And that's an opportunity for governments to come together to see how they can change either the global rules or representation in these bodies so that it's more reflective of the way that the world is now, but also prepares us for addressing the challenges of the future. And those are things that are going to be discussed over the next year in the General Assembly. And I hope that member states step up.
Perfect. Patrick, do you have a 6th or a 7th agenda, or completely agree?
Yeah, no, I have to say that Minh-Thu's summary was absolutely stellar. The one I might add on to it is, again, it's seeing whether or not the Secretary General can help raise the scale of ambition on climate change. As he says, humanity is engaged in a suicidal war with nature. Quite dramatic language from Mr. Gutierrez, but I think that what he is really reinforcing is that we are running short, very short on time to bend the curve on emissions and the climate impacts that are already hitting all of us, not least some of the most vulnerable countries in the world. And while we have these great ambitions for growth and development, we need to try as much as possible to ensure that we are not also digging ourselves into a deeper hole with respect to climate change. But I thought Minh-Thu covered the agenda magnificently.
In summary, our engaging conversation with Sir and Ma'am has provided valuable insights into the evolving currents of global dynamics. It underscores the importance of collaboration, comprehension, and resilient international institutions in tackling the diverse challenges and opportunities that our world presents. Their in-depth research and analysis offer indispensable directions for policymakers, scholars, and concerned citizens striving for a world that is secure, sustainable, and harmonious. We extend our gratitude for their time and valuable contribution to this discussion. Thank you so much, sir.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Hi, thank you.